There are two major historical legacies. One is the Ottoman political legacy. The other is the legacy of the War of Liberation Turkey went through between 1918 and 1922. 30th of August or 13th of September 1922, depending on which date you take, as the end of hostilities between Turkey and the occupation forces at the end of the First World War. I'm taking these two separately because they are separate, but they interact with each other. Both have relevance to whatever happens to occur in this country. But again, I would like to emphasize that culture is not fully determined by history. So do not think that this is the end of the story. No, we'll go on another 13 weeks or so, or 12 weeks or so after these 2 weeks are covered by this legacy, explaining how things change and where we have arrived today and what kind of a baggage we have today. Now, Ottomans were established. There's some debate about their date of establishment among historians. Sometime either at the very end of the 13th century, AD, or very beginning of the 14th century, AD. Halil İnalcık, who is probably the most important historian or student of Ottoman history, argues that Ottomans were established in the beginning of the 14th century, 1325, and not, as the legend goes, in the small town in northwestern Anatolia, Söğüt, where yesterday we had an interesting commemoration. It's a small town near Bilecik. But İnalcık argues, and repeatedly argued, that they were established in Yalova, of all places. Which is further west to the south of the Sea of Marmara. Now, irrespective of that, this original beginning did not last long. It lasted about a century. 1 century later, in 1402, near the capital city of Turkey, Ankara, in the same province, the armies of Timur the Lame, who came from Central Asia, Samarkand, Uzbekistan, defeated the Ottomans. It was a crushing defeat. Controlled the realm with an iron fist. He was an immaculate tyrant by all sense of the term, and ruled for a while. As the Ottomans among themselves got into a big internal struggle to re-establish the empire, and they were successful at it, as Mehmed I was the first Padishah, as we call it in Turkish, Sultan in English, to re-establish that empire. And it's that empire that survived until 1922. So there were two establishments. One before the Timurid known as Timur in Turkish. He was lame and was a very successful commander, finished off the Ottoman Empire, kingdom period in 1402, and then there was a comeback, re-established by Mehmed I, and then it began to develop into a major empire, expanding towards Europe and controlling Eastern Europe in the next half a century. By conquering Constantinople in 1453, it became known as no longer the Ottoman Kingdom, but Ottoman Empire. And it became an empire and that expanded not only to Europe, but eventually to the east, had to meet the challenge of the Iranians, fought them in early 16th century, defeated them, conquered some of Iran, and controlled it for a while. Today's Iran, western parts of Iran. Also, Transcaucasus, Caucasus, northern parts of the Black Sea, Crimea was a major component of the system that extended all the way to Hungary. And in mid-16th century, put a siege on Vienna, which was not successful. Another one in 1683, which was disastrous. And after that, the Ottomans were pushed back by the Habsburgs into further southeast of Europe. And in 1699, they signed a first big, humiliating treaty of Karlowitz at the very end of the 17th century, and began to lose large swaths of land in Europe. And then they had a worse enemy to emerge in the 18th century, Russia. And with Russia they had an existential fight until the very end. It was the Russian Revolution that saved the Ottomans from complete collapse at the very beginning of the First World War, 1917 revolution, which ended the Romanovs' reign over Russia, but established the Soviet Union, which continued to have a big impact on Turkey, very favorable one until the end of the Second World War, and then a hostile relationship between 1945 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now relations between Turkey and Russia are again relatively interesting. This is briefly put the picture. But so far as we're concerned, it's the domestic political characteristics that present us with a very interesting list of characters that define the Ottoman system. It was a traditional medieval empire, established as a patrimonial absolute monarchy. Now the critical concept here is patrimonial. It wasn't any type of traditional system, it was a patrimonial traditional system, which we understand the way the German sociologist Max Weber formulated it. He argues that there are three different types of authority: traditional, charismatic, and legal rational, or modern. Traditional authority is the oldest one, which depends on the idea that the legitimacy of authority emanates from tradition. Patrimonial authority is the more robust and more developed form of traditionalism, which emerges from patriarchy and is based on a dynastic rule so there is a dynasty that rules, and that dynasty gets the prerogative and the right to rule because it represents the tradition, because it had always ruled that way. And tradition, according to Weber's formulation, means a practice, a behavior, or an institution that had been with us from time immemorial. That is, from a time the origin of which even the oldest member of our society cannot remember. We have always had it that way. In practice, therefore, patrimonial rule is a rule by a member of a dynasty who is selected according to traditional rules and laws, which the Ottomans referred to as urf, which literally translates into English as custom, customary law, and use the term urfi to refer to this kind of role. And they argued that they had received their power to rule from these traditions. It was an absolute monarchy in the sense that there was no differentiation between the branches of the government. All of them had been controlled by a sultan, sort of a king, who had the right to rule because of its traditional privilege to be a member of the ruling dynasty. The oldest son, usually, assumed this title and ruled as such. This was believed to be sort of a perfect system in the understanding of, say, Plato in the Republic. It brought justice and it preserved the realm and improved the power of the realm so long as the traditions were intact, upheld, and provided the basis for rule. So under these circumstances, power of the Sultan was absolute. It was checked to a certain extent by tradition. However, tradition was nothing that anybody could pinpoint with great ease. It was a blurry, murky concept. Eventually, tradition becomes whatever the Sultan deems tradition to be in most occasions. Or those who are close to him conjure up for him as a certain rule to solve a certain problem or to attend to a certain challenge. So tradition is not necessarily an effective way of controlling the powers of a Sultan. However, when people believe that tradition was undermined, there was of course the risk of them rising up, challenging the power of the Sultan, and rebel against the Sultan. And on several occasions, sultans were killed by such rebellion and did not necessarily occur very effectively. And this system operated with a conservative majority. The subjects of the Sultan obeyed and believed so long as the Sultan acted according to tradition, and they expected such form of traditionalism, conservatism to exist in the system as much as possible. And breaching that kind of perception was costly. They could rise up against the Sultan and topple the Sultan, as they had done in 1730 and 1808 again, on two occasions in the 17th and 19th centuries, which created major changes in the Ottoman system. And then, of course, there was this part of the tradition eventually included religious laws, Sharia, especially after the sultans began to claim the role of a caliph in the system. However, from the very beginning, paying attention to the religious stricture and also the various interpretations of the clergy to ease obedience of the subjects had been part of the system. Yet none of these provided any effective control over the central authority of the Sultan. So there was some kind of arbitrariness, at times total arbitrariness of rule by the Sultan, and the power invested in the Sultan was complete, shared by no one. 100% of political power was considered to be under the control of the Sultan and as an integral part of the Sultan, shared with no one as such. I felt the need to remind you some of these concepts that I have been using during the previous lecture. Patrimonial rule is a form of authority which was defined by Max Weber, who argued that there are three different ways of producing and using power legitimately. One is what you may consider to be our current state of modern affairs, which he defined as legal rational rule. Now, as you very well know, power is an ability. Ability to make others accept our will, irrespective of whether they wish it or not. One is powerful if one can make others accept one's will, or wish, or whim, even if they didn't want to accept such kind of will, wish, or whim. So if you turn to the peer, your colleague, your friend who's sitting next to you and say, give me your pen, and she or he hands it over to you without questioning it, you have some power over that person. Simply, whatever your motives may be, once you declare your wish, it is accepted by the other party without questioning, shows that you have ability to influence that person. Generally speaking, social science now defines power as the ability to influence decisions people make about the arrangements under which they live. So if you can have an influence, that is by making a demand, pressing a certain kind of wish, will, whim, you make a change in the decision, in the direction you want that decision to change, then you have an influence over that decision. If you have that ability of influencing a decision about the arrangements under which we live, then one can assume that you have some kind of power. Now, of course, not all decisions occur this way. Some decisions are made without our influence, without us even knowing that such an influence is possible. And of course, some social arrangements occur without any decisions. Because of international change or some change in climate or whatever, certain social arrangements that we live in change without our will, as we very well know. But in those occasions where our decisions matter, our ability to influence them show how much power we wield under those circumstances. Now, some people are in a position to wield this kind of power more or less regularly, because they are believed to have a justifiable reason for wielding this kind of power. And we usually refer to this as a position of authority.
Therefore, authority is related to power, but a specific kind of relationship, which we need to define more carefully. Authority is that ability to use power justified by the beliefs of the voluntary obedient. So one has justification to use this kind of power in the eyes of those who obey the decisions being made by that person. So authority not only involves power but also obedience. If, therefore, there is a general understanding and belief that someone has the power to make decisions in a way that are considered as reasonable for us, or morally justifiable for us, or serves the kinds of goals that they should be serving, so far as we're concerned, we obey them. Under those circumstances, it's relatively easy to rule a country. Weber argued that these decisions ought to be in such a form that those who obey them should think that even if they were alone in the world and they were in the position of making these decisions, they would have done exactly the same. So these decisions should come to these people as normal, natural, spontaneously agreeable. That's the way it should be. If general public shares this kind of view on the decisions being made, then they find it morally imperative that they accept these decisions and follow them. Therefore, obedience would be very, very easy. Compliance with these decisions create no problems, and therefore it'll be easy for those who rule. Power relations therefore include, on the one hand, authority, the legitimate right of making decisions, due to a certain moral position, following an objective or a goal that is acceptable to all, or involves some kind of manipulation, and if nothing works, as a last resort, coercion. Manipulation is again a very important source of power, one that is wielded unbeknown by the powerless. Those who do not have power do not even know that there is some kind of manipulation in the decisions being made, in the way they are made. They are not usually faced with this sort of situation. As a last resort, authority can use power by application of sheer physical force, brute force, beating people on the head, pepper gassing them, killing them in large numbers, if need be, to elicit compliance or obedience from the masses under these circumstances. Now, in most occasions, the huge majority of society are people who are relatively powerless. Powerlessness is not necessarily a problem for the authorities or implementation of decisions. Powerlessness does not automatically lead to any kind of reaction or rebellion or revolution eventually. Powerlessness usually leads to inaction. You do nothing, apathetic, stay on the side, don't pay any attention. Creates large amount of apathy. In modern societies, we have plentiful of that. Look at participation rates in the elections, local elections, in referendum. You see huge swaths of the population unmoved by anything of the sort. They don't care. They're apathetic. They're not powerful, and they are not acting. Now, the basis of authority is such that individuals in public positions are vested with a certain amount of power. They possess some power over their fellow citizens. And they exercise that power in accordance with a legally defined structure, directed towards a publicly acknowledged goal. We usually, nowadays, correlate authority with certain public positions, the incumbents of which are usually elected or appointed through procedures that are legally defined. And once they are enthroned or installed in these incumbencies, in these positions, they have the power to act in accordance with these legally defined structures. We usually refer to them as offices. It is the office holders who have these kinds of power, and that legality and legitimacy of their decisions that come out of this office is what we understand to be the basis of legal rational authority. It is the public aspects of an office in which the incumbent is supposed to keep the private aspects of his or her life out, which becomes the basis of their decisions and action, which then provides them with legitimacy to act on public matters, to make changes in the arrangements in which we live, in the societies we live. But of course, this is a current understanding of office, which has more to do with a certain bureau. And we call the incumbents of these bureaus bureaucrats. And that is a novelty which was ushered in by 18th, perhaps even the 19th century. Very, very new. Officers of the previous era did not make this kind of distinction or differentiation between the public and the private aspects of the incumbent's life in this case, and therefore the individual playing this role was not expected to act in compliance with public perceptions that are related with a certain position which is entrusted with certain legal structures that are to be rationally used to create decisions and implement them. In contradiction to this and completely opposite to this, argued Weber, exists the charismatic authority. This is a form of authority inherent in an individual, a person. Usually, his examples are from messianic religious leaders, prophets, many of them in the Middle East. In a charter by Mehmet II, the conqueror of Istanbul, he argued that there were 120,000 prophets in the name of who he acts. 120,000, not a few. So there are many examples of messianic religious leaders developing in this part of the world, and we are now observing some of them in most recent affairs. ISIS or ISIL or IS, whatever the name, has such a leader now, Ibrahim al-Baghdadi. He calls himself Caliph. Ask us to follow him because of his charisma. Who, through his or her own virtue and example, crystallizes a different kind of authority. An authority that emanates from his or her personal characteristics. Now, these characteristics may not be real, according to Weber. They may indeed be completely counterfactual. And this person may indeed be nobody special, but a charlatan, a demagogue. Doesn't matter. He argued that so long as his followers believed in his charisma, that he has superordinary properties which no other people share, then they would follow this person. And after the death of this person, it's possible that these various characteristics could be incorporated into a legal system, which Weber talks about routinization of charisma. It can become routine, and others may argue that they share some of this charisma as such. So when we talk about charismatic person, the person in this question is believed to have by the followers, and it's their belief that is important, not that this person is a prophet. He or she may not be a prophet, can indeed be a complete charlatan. But so long as it is believed that he or she has enormous superordinary properties, he would be believed in to occupy the position of authority, make decisions that we obey because of the charisma. And these charismatic individuals, of course, are not only religious characters, but nationalist leaders. Some major politicians. The term has been used by political scientists to refer to such people as Abdel Gamal Nasser of Egypt, or Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, or Charles de Gaulle, General Charles de Gaulle of France. Charismatic figures, father of France, etc. So long as it's believed that this person has this kind of extraordinary and superordinary characteristics by the masses and followed by a large swath of the population, charismatic authority exists. Now, the traditional authority is something in between the two. It comes in, according to Weber, three different forms: patriarchal, patrimonial, and feudal. As the term indicates, there's something with father in there, patri. And indeed, parochialism is the least developed, according to Weber, and the most primitive form of traditional authority that exists within a family, between a leading patriarch, a father, or a matriarch in the case of a mother, and the rest of the family, who accept on moral grounds the superiority of this authority, go along with this authority, and obey this authority. And then, when it develops further, it becomes a more elaborate hierarchy, and much more complicated, grows both in size and becomes more complex in functions. It changes into a patrimonial form of government, more developed form of government, in which it is a person rather than an office holder who is ascribed with authority. Therefore, by definition, patrimonial authority is personal, not the public office holder, not the legal structure of the office that exists in clarity, which is to be implemented rationally by someone who occupies the office. It's the person who occupies this office who is ascribed authority, not any office holder. While in contrast to charisma, there is an office involved here, where charisma assumes no office. It's just the individual who has the authority outside the legal structure, outside the realm. No norms are to be imposed on the charismatic individual. Whereas in this case, there is an office, right? It's the person who is ascribed authority who happens to be in that office, not the office itself and the public realm of the office. And of course, in this case, the private characteristics of the individual play a major role beyond that of a public persona of this individual following these rules. Therefore, there is a lot of personalism involved in this, and the person is firmly, therefore, anchored in a social and political order, which is defined by certain norms and customs, but there is a lot of personalism involved in making these decisions and ruling as such. This is still the authority of a father over the children. So the relationship is, in this case, is personal, cloaked in the characteristics of the person, therefore at most times arbitrary, and it conforms to various social norms and structures and political norms and customs as such. Therefore, it is structured to a certain extent, but not to the extent of the legal rational decision maker of an office holder. This is not a bureaucrat we're talking about, not even a modern day prime minister or a minister or a president of any sort. This is an individual who is a king perhaps, a sheikh, or any major lord who acts alone, has the prerogative to act alone and make any decision on all matters of life and death for everyone, and to make the final decision as a person. And he is not in a position to differentiate between the private and the public realms of his existence under those circumstances. So it's in between. Feudal, according to Weber, is a decentralized form of traditional authority in which the king is sort of primus inter pares, first among lords, lord of lords, so to speak. But lords have real power, and the king shares power with the lords. And lords have a say over the king. And there are also legal norms and structures that the king and the lords should obey. Otherwise, they could be punished by other lords who also have enormous amount of power. Whereas in patrimonial authority, power is not shared. Power is in the hands of the father, just like the medieval father who rules the house or household with an iron fist. So the relationship between the patrimonial ruler and the ruled is something like that of a father of a household and the children, in that sense of the term, where the power of the father is full, perfect, not shared by anybody else on legal basis, which in Latin we call de jure basis. So de jure sharing of power does not exist between the patrimonial either and followers. There is, of course, some kind of a hierarchy, some officialdom, an official picture. However, that does not necessarily operate without the characteristics of the individual who occupies the top job. For example, in patrimonial armies, you can find stellar successes, victories at war, but at times when the commander dies, the entire army collapses, almost instantly at war, because they're not following a bureaucratic hierarchical structure in which command structure is so established that the next in command is visible and legitimately acceptable to take over the powers from the commander when the commander dies at war. And this is a very clear case of what happens under these circumstances. So, as opposed to this decentralized form of authority, patrimonial authority is by definition is highly centralized and personalized. And that is what we're talking about in the Ottoman case. So when I'm talking about patrimonial absolute monarchy, I'm talking about a single power wielder, one individual, Padishah, the Sultan, who has 100% of power, shares it with no one, legally. De facto, there may be some strong person who can protect himself or herself from the wrath of the Sultan, and therefore his power could be limited. But in theory, legitimately, one person has all political power. Everybody else has zero amount of power in comparison to the Sultan. That's the absolute patrimonial monarchy we're talking about here. And this is a point that you have to be very much at home with when we're talking about power relations in Turkish politics, even today. That is what, for example, the president of Turkey, who was elected on the 10th of August, assumes. He's above the law. He is above the state. He is between us and God. Comes directly from this understanding of patrimonialism. And it's a neo-patrimonial form to which I will allude eventually after we go down the system. Now, let me give you a snapshot of the Ottoman system operating under this set of rules, of patrimonial rule. The Sultan is at the center and apex of the administrative system. Sultan has full power, controls everything, shares it with no one. No one else has any legitimate power in comparison to the Sultan. There is no control mechanism, there are no checks, there are no balances, no countervailing force, except, as I mentioned, traditions, which are vague, Sharia law, which are not very effective in controlling the Sultan, and the rebelliousness of the people, which occurred from time to time. And they killed the Sultan and replaced the Sultan with somebody else. But these are the only occasions in which the Sultan's power could be checked. The Sharia law was important, but Ottomans were not a theocracy in any sense of the term. Let me be very careful about this. I'll give you one anecdote from Naima's history. Naima narrates in his history book that Murad IV who was a sultan, reigned in the 17th century between 1623 and 1640, had a very powerful mother. Mothers played a lot of role in the sultans, whose name at birth was Anastasia, converted to Islam later on, and became the mother of the sultan. He ascended to the throne at the age of 11, not even an adolescent, as a child. Murad IV, mother, Kösem, approached him one day, shared with him a note written by Shaykhul Islam, the Grand Mufti of the Ottoman Empire, who headed the religious institution, requesting in a very elegant and subtle way that a certain judge under his jurisdiction, for the religious institution both adjudicated religion and religious law, Sharia. Therefore, he was also responsible for the legal system and wanted to preserve this qadi, as they were called, from prosecution. And the qadi was removed from this job by the Sultan's intervention. She wanted her son to reconsider this case. Murad IV was furious that this man, Shaykhul Islam, could think of such a thing. This is the guy who is supposed to be in charge of imposing the Sharia on the system. He sacked him and sent him to exile to an Aegean island. He was an old elderly gentleman, according to Naima. He left Istanbul on a ship, and so did his son on a different ship. But after they departed, he got even more furious. So sent some soldiers after them, but on the land, cavalry. And said, if you can catch up with them before they exit the Dardanelles, which is the main exit from the Sea of Marmara to our southwest, to the Aegean, let them go. If you catch them before they get out of Dardanelles, execute them. A storm occurred in between. Because of the storm, this elderly gentleman, Shaykhul Islam, decided to stay in the Sea of Marmara and took refuge in Silivri, which is not too far away from Istanbul. And his son, being more courageous, audacious, young, went on through the storm. They caught the Shaykhul Islam, killed him, buried him in the sand in Silivri. And Naima writes in his history book that he had prepared a very nice grave for himself, which went empty. That is the relationship between the Sultan and the Shaykhul Islam. The person who's supposed to be imposing the stricture of the law. Okay? I want you to understand the kind of power relationship between these people. And he was not the first to be executed. We observe the same phenomenon occurring over the years. You can always find clergy who would be ready to bow to political power and give them the religious edict that they want. 600 years of Ottoman history is a witness to that. Very simple. That is the relationship between religion and politics in the Islamic court. So, as a result, you have primacy of politics in all matters. And the term politics in the Ottoman Empire was never used as we use it today in Turkey as siyaset. It was always used as siyaseten katl. In documents, in official writings, etc., this is the term you would find. And qatl means murder, political murder. Politics is a way of murdering people. It's bleak, bloody, and full of very high risk. Even today, some Turkish politicians argued, for example, Turgut Özal, until he died in 1993, who is still influencing Turkish politics to a certain extent with his ideas, used to argue that he has two shirts, mintan. One he defined as idamlık, for execution, death, and the other bayramlık, for festivities. That's the risk. You either rule or you're dead. A very stark understanding of politics. And its primacy extends into all areas. Religion is not exempted, so the religion can be easily manipulated by the power holders, and their actions can be legitimized on the basis of urfi law, customary law, which entrusts the office of the patrimonial ruler with traditional rule. And on the basis of protecting the realm and its benefits and interests, the Sultan can do anything. Now, this is, of course, a situation in which Shaykh al-Islam is a Muslim, a free-born individual who had legal status. Most of the other characters around him were not free-born Muslims. They were Christians or non-Muslims who were converted to Islam at a very young age through a process called devshirme. Especially from Southeastern Europe, large numbers of young children at the ages of 5, 6 even will be screened by the state officials. They will be selected to serve in the palace. They would become converts into Islam and would be raised to serve in the palace without any personal status. They are kapukulu, as they're called in Turkish, which means slave of the door. They're slave officials. The devshirme system produces slave officials who served in the Privy Council as viziers or grand viziers, Nishancı or Reisül Küttab, etc., Defterdar, whatever. Originally became Janissaries. These are the slave official armed forces around the Sultan, protected him, stayed in the palace, stayed with him during war. Therefore, in battles, they would be around him. And of course, there were cavalry in the military institution. Cavalry was conscripted from a complicated system of fiefs owned by religious heroes who tilled the land, sold the produce, and kept a certain number of men ready for war. They would provide for their horses, look after these people, they will train them, and these people could be called on any minute, and they will get on their horses and participate in the army. So 2 major divisions, and this is, of course, a completely different force than the religious institution. They are the military institution, which had various characters, like the chief's script, who later on became Reisül Küttab, which in today's terminology is foreign minister. But this person also carried the seal of the Sultan and inscribed it whenever it was necessary on official documentation. Defterdar was the authority on the finances of the palace and also the realm, and the viziers of various nature, and the grand vizier would be today's premier, so to speak, next in line. But don't assume that grand viziers had any power vis-a-vis the Sultan. No, that is not true. 120 grand viziers served in the Ottoman Empire. 43 of them were executed by the decision of the Sultan, without a trial, without any defense, on most occasions on whim. The Sultan didn't like something about them, heard some gossip, didn't like this character very much. He started to get on his nerves. He was gone. And politically, in protocol, he's number one, all the power, he's number two, and harem asa is number three. The gentleman in charge of the harem, the household of the Sultan. Harem is his household, and it's part of the state, as you can see. No difference between private and public realm. Harem asa was always an African, usually from the Sudan or southern Egypt, and castrated, so that he could have no sexual relationship with any women in the harem. And this person would be in charge of the harem, which means not in charge of the women in the harem, that too perhaps to a certain extent, but mostly the household of the Sultan. And he could see the Sultan without any permission at any point in time and talk to him directly, closest to his ear. Had a lot of influence on him, obviously. In this system, since it's so personal, those who are closest to the Sultan are those who are most influential, able to influence his ideas. Who are they? Mother. Mother of his children, and the Iqbal. He liked the most in the harem. Then harem asa, and a few others who could become very influential. In a modern-day patrimonial system, for example, King Farouk of Egypt, before he was toppled in the early 1950s by Gamal Abdel Nasser and others in Egypt, had a coiffeur and a chauffeur who were extremely powerful on him. Because they were closest to him, he was spending a lot of time with them, and they were very influential. Those of you who go to barber shops for a haircut know how chatty the barbers can be. You know, and it's legitimate that they talk. Okay, so under these circumstances, the central system was connected with the peripheral forces through local notables, townfolk, peasants, and nomads. The most important agent of the center, who was constantly embedded in the local areas, was the Qadi, who operated under two kazaskers. So two kazasker, one for Rumeli, one for Anatolia, top judges, who looked after the personnel matters of all Qadis. And the Qadi would be a major figure established here in the rural areas, in the smaller cities, throughout the periphery of the country, and they would adjudicate the law. And on most occasions, they were almost like the governors of the provinces, looked into all matters that pertained to all sorts of conflict, and they also communicated with the center effectively. And they were also instrumental in pushing the demands of the people to the Sultan, actually to the Grand Vizier's office, and the Grand Viziers would act on them. Every individual who was embedded in that local area could write directly to the Sultan any petition, personally or communally. We don't have many personal petitions until about 1847. Previously, we had communal petitions written in large numbers. Mostly they were referred to as imdatname, call for help. And these were acted upon by the Sultan, and they were usually penned by the judge, Qadi. And there were also a lot of complaints about the Qadi, who became corrupt. Since they were the enforcers of laws and interpreters of the laws, adjudicating the laws, you had any conflict with them, you were doomed. We know from economic history works that by the 17th century, Most of the Qadi were involved in loan sharking activity. They were gaining a lot of money as salary, which they had no way of spending. So they were loaning them to the Reaya, mostly Christian peasants, at usurious levels of interest. Usury, rib'a in Arabic, is a big sin according to the Quran. Qadi practiced it daily. 10% interest rate per month. Ridiculous. And the Reaya would not be in a position to pay back. Who were they supposed to appeal, object, or bring a complaint to? The judge. Who loaned them the money? The judge. So they objected to this, wrote to the palace. They wanted palace action. Palace got into action. In 1620s, for example, in Serez, we know from economic history works, again, research indicates that the palace decided to decrease their tenure from 6 years to 2 years. What happened? Instead of raising a certain amount of money by serving that region for 6 years, they started to raise the same kind of money in 2 years. Corruption became even worse. This eventually contributed to a considerable amount of unrest in that region, and in the 19th century culminated in nationalist uprisings in the Balkans, and they sort of referred to the yoke of the Ottoman rule to this sort of activity as well under these circumstances. So this system consisted of a centralized power with its own culture, personnel, congregated around the Sultan, where Sultan has 100% of power, shared it with no one, and used it arbitrarily, without any effective control, effective, predictable pattern control by any countervailing force. No lords, nothing. This created a certain impression of an overwhelmingly powerful state and an overwhelmingly powerful center, a cult of state, and an inclination for central power, which we refer to as centralism. It's believed that center mattered more than anything else under these circumstances. Now, this form of cult of state created a certain image of political opposition, as in Turkish, fitne ve fücur, which in English means mischief and intrigue, or even sedition. So there is no opposition. There is either mischief or intrigue or sedition. Sultan is always right. 100% of the time, all the time. Can't be wrong. Anybody who opposes the Sultan, the patrimonial ruler, and the government must be involved in some kind of sedition, some mischief. Ready to rebel, has to be hit hard on the head. If possible, eliminated by execution, killing. Political opposition, therefore, had no room in this kind of conception of authority and the legitimate power that authority is entrusted with, and the style of rule under these circumstances. In recent years, those of you who lived in Turkey have seen many examples of it emerging in a neo-patrimonial fashion in Turkey, where there has been a huge effort by a conservative government to render all opposition as a form of sedition, fitne ve fücur, in essence, and delegitimize all of that. under these circumstances. They're following a cultural pattern that had been in place for an extensively long period of time. There have been many attempts at changing the Ottoman system to cope with the military challenges that the Ottomans faced. The Ottoman system as constructed was accepted as a perfect system in perfect harmony, working perfectly well in the Platonic sense of the term. Those of you who read The Republic of Plato, and those of you who haven't, must read it. It's a basic text for politics. It's a vision of politics in which you would understand what I mean by a perfect state. A perfect state, in the definition of Plato, is one that is immutable, does not mutate, change. For a perfect state could only change for the worse. It can't be improved because it's perfect. Very simple. So his argument in page 3 of his book on the Republic defines change as equal to decay. All change is decadence, he argues. Anything that changes, changes for the worse. There is no improvement, no progress in life. Change brings decay. It is rotting change. And he argues that, life is, of course I'm obfuscating and simplifying, I know that, but when you read Plato's initial arguments, it looks as if life is a great race from the cradle to the grave. And it's a downhill race. You're born perfect the day you're born, and then you start to decompose, decay, rot, die, and decompose completely. That's his vision. So something quite similar is at play here. It is assumed that the Ottoman system was a perfect system. Even today, a certain brand of conservatism in Turkey believes that the main reason why Turkey is in the state of that it is because we have veered away from the perfect system. And there is always this kind of argument of going back to that glorious golden age of the Ottoman perfect system. But the perfect system misperformed dramatically. Where? At the battleground. Smaller, better trained armies endowed with the fruits of industrial revolution, machine guns, artillery units, performing different strategies very easily. That was the beginning of the end for the Ottomans, and they started to argue that there's something wrong with the military system. They had to fix it. They had to change all of that. And it was tried many times in the 18th century. Initial timid steps were taken in the tulip period, 1718 through 1730. This is the period in which the Ottoman elite of the center started to talk with their counterparts, mostly Europeans, especially the dragomans. These are the interpreters who knew Western languages, especially Italian and eventually Russian, also French, which was, of course, the lingua franca of the 18th and 19th centuries in diplomacy, could talk to these people, and they were approached by the Ottoman elite, and they started to converse with these people at length about what it is that the Europeans were doing that they were not doing. For they considered themselves to be an imperial force in Europe, in competition with other imperial forces. So in that period, 1718 through 1730, there seems to be some move in the direction of something like Ottoman Renaissance. Intellectual Renaissance, of course. And The Grand Vizier was very fond of tulips. Nevşehirli Damat İbrahim Pasha. He was the son-in-law of Ahmet III, the Sultan. And in a very short period of time, Istanbul started to experience a lot of tulip gardens by the elite. Eventually, the demand for it was so high that the tulip bulb, especially the rare types, began to cost a fortune. And this has created a certain image of the tulip as the flower of the Ottomans first, which became famous. The Habsburgs purchased some, eventually sold them to Netherlands, which until today has become the flower of Netherlands. Whereas tulip in Turkey is the symbol of decadence. For the people of Istanbul, who were not so well off at the time, considered this much investment in tulips as a form of decadence. They rose up against it and eventually deposed the Sultan, burnt the flowers, and the tulip period is over with. Resulted in the rebellion of the people, led by some Janissary, converted into an hammam attendant, Turkish bath attendant, Patrona Halil. He was a resourceful guy, an Albanian. He organized the Janissaries, the Janissaries, to rise up against the Sultan and depose him. And actually ruled for a little while before he was executed, as usual. Then this period went into a lull, and then came another major effort at modernizing the army, which is known as the period of Selim III. He introduced a new army. Nizam-ı Cedid, the new order. Cedid means new, Nizam means order, new order for the military. This didn't last very long. It was also a cause for rebellion in 1807. Kabakçı Mustafa, who was the major character at the time, who actually was at a battalion in Garipçe. He was a yamak. Yamak were soldiers protecting the straits from Russian and Ukrainian pirates and Russian incursion. Garipçe is the town right next to which is Koç University's campus now. He was instrumental in toppling Selim III and end this renovation period of the military, which was finally accomplished after 1825 with the complete annihilation of the Janissary forces, who were massacred, in which the inhabitants of Istanbul participated, and for 6 months, whoever they caught who were taller than average, they hanged without question on the trees of Istanbul. For Janissaries came from Southeastern Europe. They're from the Balkans, Serbs, Croats, some, Slovenes, tall people. Suspect that these were Janissaries who were in hiding, who came out a while later, and they simply hanged these people. The people of Istanbul did that for a while. In 1825, it was over with. And a new army was established in its place, and an entire new period started after this. But the rural society and agricultural economy of the Ottoman Empire emerged as a major impediment to all of these changes. Ottomans soon enough discovered that renovating the military alone wasn't enough, because modern age military is the greediest establishment you can find. They devour money just like nothing else. And they always want new toys, even today. We have a big problem. The defense budgets increase all the time, bulge, and you never know how many guns you need to feel secure. What kinds of guns? How many warplanes do you want? How many battleships would provide you security? The more the better. As a result of which, those who are conscious about security always push for more. Well, modern army required a lot of investment, a lot of money. And the rural economy of the Ottoman Empire that was based on agricultural production using techniques that had not been up to date was not enough to provide the tax income for the Ottomans to provide for the new army. For a while, the incomes of the Ottoman Empire also came from the trade between East, that is Asia, especially China and India, in spices, and the West, Europe. And all that trade went through Eastern Mediterranean. And the Ottomans controlled the Eastern Mediterranean from about 1520 onwards. So they benefited a lot. However, all of that changed because of that kind of power of the Ottomans over that trade, as Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and others started to look for alternative ways of reaching the markets of India and China, and they discovered them. Of course, what Columbus discovered was not India, but a new continent. And he didn't even discover the new continent. He ended up in the Caribbean somewhere and landed on an island there. But eventually it was discovered that there's a whole continent to the west of that location. And in a very short period of time, North Atlantic trade became the most important source of revenue for a lot of states. And majority of mercantile activity moved from Eastern Mediterranean to Northern Atlantic. The Ottomans did not rose up to this fact. Ellsworth, an economist, who has made a calculation for the 17th century trade between Britain and the southern parts of the United States and the Caribbean, argued that for every sterling pound invested, it was possible to gain 11 pounds. Huge profit. This includes, in his calculation, all those ships that went down, sank. All those capital invested lost. So the actual revenue, the total revenue was higher than that. So there was a huge amount of trade as ships departed from ports of Britain, went to the west of Africa, collected cheap labor, usually bought them from the chiefs of various tribes there, hold them in despicable circumstances to the other side of the Atlantic, sold them as slaves, where slave trade was official, and was declared unofficial in the 19th century, as you very well know. And in return for which they got sugarcane and cotton from Louisiana and hold them back to Britain and started to establish the textile industry and sugar refining and other food industry. And that created a huge source of income, accumulated income in the 17th century, which precipitated the Industrial Revolution in Britain, followed by other countries soon after. But even before that, in the 16th century, as the Spanish and the Portuguese started to haul gold and precious metals from the new continent, Americas, they were hit by the British Navy, or pirates, should we say. Some of them changed hands, but most of them hit the European market, where it was legal tender. That was used in international trade, which led to a huge increase in money supply, which means inflation. When production does not go up with the money supply, the result is an inflationary pressure. And this led to a a new game of trade between the Ottoman lands and the West. Venetians could come to the Ottoman shores and buy sheep, cereals, and other material at much higher prices than the Ottoman government was ready to pay the peasants for the same produce. And black markets started to emerge, and they spiraled, and the government started to impose various measures on agricultural production, but they were not able to control the inflationary pressure, which started to lead to the downfall of agricultural production. A lot of people who left their farms, who are known as çift bozan, increased in large numbers by the 17th century, 16th century. And a time came when Suleiman the Magnificent, who is believed to be the most powerful sultan of all times, had great difficulty finding enough food to feed the people in Istanbul. And for 150 years, Ottomans were faced with a very serious challenge in Anatolia, where peasants organized into bands and started to fight the agents of the state. Eventually, the Janissaries were assigned to bring some kind of security to Anatolia. They were able to beat the Janissary army also. And we have many folkloric characters. Some of you may have heard this in your literature courses, such as Köroğlu, for example, from Bolu. And these are all bandits who rose up against the Ottoman center and fought their way into some kind of control of the Ottoman land, of course, on de facto basis. Now, this is encapsulated in a work by an economic historian, Mustafa Akta, in a book called Celali İsyanları. Unfortunately, it's only in Turkish, so those of you who can read Turkish can get a very good account of what happened, how the Ottoman economy collapsed as the trade center of the world moved from Eastern Mediterranean to Northern Atlantic, how the American gold created a huge inflationary pressure in Europe first and then on the Ottomans, and how it degenerated the Ottoman, immaculately perfect Ottoman agricultural system and led to its collapse. It is now rewritten in modern day Turkish and published by Yapı Kredi Bankası, so you can find a newer version of the same book in, with a slightly different name, produced in the recent times. About 3 years ago it was republished. Now this, of course, led to a big problem of financing the state, and by the 19th century, Ottoman state came under a huge financial duress, especially after modernization, especially with 1854 Crimean War, and by 1881, Ottomans declared moratorium, that they couldn't pay their debt to the owners. A new debt administration was established by the name of Duyun-u Umumiye, which means debt administration, which established its own police force, its own legal system, its own courts, its own tax collecting machinery, and it's the building of Istanbul Erkek Lisesi today. So if you visit the city, go to Karaköy, look up towards Topkapı Palace, turn a little left, you'll see a huge building overlooking the Golden Horn. That is the building of the Debt Management Agency. If you visit the building, you will see that it has full of goals and dungeons where they kept those who didn't pay their taxes. And that was the building of debt administration until the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1922. Then it was taken over by the Turkish government and turned into a lycée. Its language of instruction is German. It's one of the most reputable high schools in Turkey, in Istanbul today. But basically, the Ottomans were not able to convert their agricultural economy to an industrial economy and go through an industrial revolution, as a result of which the reforms had a huge problem that they could not solve. So out of these clash of empires, the Ottoman elite, intellectuals, youth had a deepening sense of losing its own metal and realm in the European power game. This is best exemplified in the Terkib event of Ziya Pasha. I can't translate that in English, his poem. First, in his original words. Diyar-ı küfrü gezdim, beldeler, kâşhaneler gördüm. Dolaştım mülki İslam'ı, bütün viraneler gördüm. Okay? You understand that? Those of you who know Turkish? Okay. Today's Turkish. This is what it means. This is my interpretation in English, which may not be perfect. I journeyed through the heathen lands, which means Europe, saw the flourishing cities and gorgeous dwellings. In all the realm of Islam I visited, I saw wrecked and ruined buildings and cities. In the 19th century, more and more sons, not daughters, there was sex discrimination, I'm sorry for that, but that's how it was, were sent over to Europe in larger numbers for education to major capitals, major cities, which had a big cultural impact on them. This is one of them. They suddenly discovered that civilization they faced in Europe was completely different what they considered to be their perfect civilization at home. There's a stark difference, and Ziya Pasha argues that this is something that is produced, and this gives him a feeling of humility, a loser feeling. It is through the same process that the Ottoman youth began to learn some new concepts for the very first time in their lives and started to imagine a different way of living that they had never considered earlier. Ottoman society was built on the pillars of religion. 4 religious communities. They were called millet each. They were the Greek Orthodox, Armenian Gregorian, Jewish, and Muslim. This was organized into various legal organizations and structures. Therefore, it's now referred by the students of Ottoman history as millet system. Of course, they didn't use the term system then, for it was invented in the 1930s by von Bertalanffy to refer to the brain. So system is a modern concept. Each had its own church or religious institution, which happened to be responsible to the Ottomans for tax purposes. The non-Muslims paid a tax which was relatively sizable in the beginning, but by 19th century miserably low. Nothing big. They didn't serve in the military. In return for that, Muslims did. Now, all of the change with the beneficent reforms of 1839, equality was brought into the picture upon the insistence of the Russian and the British ambassadors, which unexpectedly was most resisted by the non-Muslim churches. For that now meant that they wouldn't be paying this very little tax, which wasn't so hard to pay, but in return for that, they would be serving in the military for undefined periods of time. They would be sent over to defend Yemen, against whom? God knows. Defend what? For 25, 30 years, at the naive age of 18, 19, 20, and come back old men at the age of 45, when life expectancy was no more than 45 years anyway. Nobody would recall these people. Those of you who have read Rip Van Winkle, we had many examples of that. They didn't want to go through this process themselves. They don't want to serve in the military for long periods of time, which they were avoiding earlier. So equality before the law created a big, big problem for them. But at the same time, when students were sent from even the Muslim communities after the beneficent reforms to Europe for education, they started to learn that in Europe there was something called nation state, not based on anything of the sort. And in fact, when they were asked in the customs what their nationality happened to be, most of them responded, especially the Muslims, Islam. Customs officer said, that's religion. What's your nationality? They didn't know. They had no answer for that. But that made them curious. So they started to study what nationality was all about. It looked like race, but it wasn't. Anything racial was considered to be a sinful identity by the Muslims, for that connoted tribalism, kawmiya, as the Holy Quran calls it, which is a sin. So they don't want to be involved in sin. So what was that? Nationalism. What was a national identity? So a very long period of time, they had difficulty grappling with this problem. Eventually, they began to use the word millet, not for religious community, same concept for national community or nation. Today in Turkish, millet means nation. We also use the term ulus, which became fashionable after 1930s when there was a language reform, but the term millet was the only concept that they could come up with, and they started to add certain non-religious characteristics of the people to it. And eventually, many of them who spoke Turkish began to use the term Türk milleti as part of this formulation, which in the original understanding of the millet system was nothing valuable, to tell you the truth. In 1828, Halit Efendi was sent over to Paris as the first standing ambassador of the Ottomans to serve in the capital of France as a standing ambassador. He was introduced in the court as the Turkish ambassador, and the man was livid. He cursed the interpreter left the room. It led to a scandal. The French didn't understand what was happening. So the interpreter ran after him and said, "Sir, what happened?" He said, "Tell your bosses that in due time they will discover that I am a gentleman." For a Turkish Halit Efendi, who was also Turkish, referred to the nomadic tribes of Anatolia, who he despised, looked down upon, and considered them as meatheads. The term they used, an Arabic term, etrak bi idrak. Etrak is the plural of Turk in Arabic. And this is an Arabic term, etrak bi idrak, which means, well, literally, it should mean meathead. Those who cannot think. Turks who have no capacity to think. So for Halit Efendi, Turk was a denigration, an insult, directly. He wasn't Turk. He was Ottoman, above these meatheads of Anatolia, these nomads. After the events of the 19th century, through re-education of nationalism, etc., at the end of the century, under especially, ironically, Abdülhamit II, when a lot more Turks arrived from, especially Russia, as they were developing Turkish nationalism in Russia, and were, of course, persecuted by the Russian Tsars and fled to the Ottoman Empire, the very image of the Turk changed into something very honorable and very high. Mehmet Emin Yurdakul, a major nationalistic poet, was asked to write a poem according to some arguments, allegations, or suggestions by the Sultan himself. His famous poem, "Ben bir Türk'üm, dinim cinsim uludur." I am a Turk. My race and my religion is grand. From the dumb meathead Turk, converted into a grand Turk, whose religion and race is superior to the rest of the world. They would go on to argue that if Turks had not lived, history would not have found anything to write on human development. From one end to another. Turkish nationalism. It developed in the Ottoman Empire, eventually came to us. It emerged out of this feeling of being humiliated, left in decay, in a decadent empire that is collapsing. Look at the way he refers, Ziya Pasha, in the same poem to government. Bulundum ben dahi dar-ı şifai Baba Ali'de, felatunu beğenmez anda çok divaneler gördüm. Now this is Ottoman language again. Some of you may understand it. Dar-ı şifai Baba Ali means lunatic asylum. And Baba Ali is the name of the government. He calls the government a lunatic asylum. A lot of respect, huh? And he's a pasha. Highest ranked official in the system. Officials would stand from Effendi, go up to Bey, and eventually will become pasha. Arabs call it basha. And it's not necessarily just general, although generals were called pasha because they were high up. So there was a complete alienation and downgrading and disrespect for the system of governance in the eyes of these people. Then he goes on to sort of explaining 19th century world as he sees it. Cihan namındaki bir maktele ama yolum düştü. I sort of trespassed something called the world, a location of mass murders. He argues that the world is nothing but a place where there's mass murder going on. Hükümet derler anda bir nice salhaneler gördüm. Salhane is a slaughterhouse, and he refers to this government this time as a slaughterhouse, which is involved in politics as murder. It's a systematized, legitimized way of murdering, massacring people, he argues, is what government is all about. So there is full disenchantment with the Ottoman way of conducting business by late 19th century, as you can see in this poem of Ziya Pasha, Terkibi Bent, which is very interesting. What has changed, how much, we will cover. But in this competition, much has been lost, as a result of which there is this sense of being left behind, losers, and living in a political arrangement that is not performing, huge mismanagement of government, an enormous amount of corruption occurring, and it's ruled by physical force which loses all its legitimacy in the eyes of these people. Seems to have emerged. But through this process, we observe the emergence of something like political opposition in the Ottoman system after the 1839 reforms. So the idea never existed earlier, but crept into the system at the same time as the system was evolving to import new concepts, new ways of thinking. A mental shift was occurring. We should credit Mustafa Reşit Pasha, the standing ambassador to Britain this time, about the same time of Halit Efendi, who observed the performance of the members of parliament in the British Parliament. He was taken there, he watched them. He first saw the Grand Vizier, meaning the Prime Minister, rise up and talk about a matter. Then he saw on the opposite side of the counter the leader of the opposition standing up and criticizing the Prime Minister. And in his memoirs he says, now the police will come, arrest this guy, and chop his head off. Nothing of the sort happened. He sat down. Then the Prime Minister, the Grand Vizier, came up again and talked. And the opposition leader talked more. There was a question and answer session. And after all of it's over, they got out of the chamber, they walked to a pub and started to eat and drink together. He was shocked, dumbfounded. Somebody would criticize the government and be permitted to live. Was amazing in and of itself. But rub shoulders with the government at the same time? Crazy, he thought first. Then eventually, a revolutionary idea entered his mind. It is possible for a Grand Vizier to protect his head from the sword of the Sultan. That's a great idea. After 1839, only one Grand Vizier was killed by the Sultan, Abdülhamit II, Mithat Pasha. And on the official records, he died of an epidemic in Taif. The Sultan could not even write that he ordered him to be killed. Times had changed. So the reform period of 1839 ushered in new understanding of conducting business, creating a new officialdom, bureaus, and certain legal structures that enabled the Sultan to limit his own powers, and by limiting his power over these bureaus, those who served as the officialdom could now be something like bureaucrats and protect their private lives from encroachment upon them by the Sultan. So the relationship between the slave official and the Sultan was no more. And the Sultans could no longer be absolute in their power from then on, officially, legally. They could be de facto, but not de jure. And it's a big, big change. And from then on, opposition became a possibility in the Ottoman culture. Eventually, opposition parties were established, which we will look into, by the changes in the system, which adopted a written constitution in 1876, and another major change occurred after 1908. The constitution changed after 1909. Opposition parties began to emerge, and they're still with us today, with some difficulty, but they exist. So the problem of performance of the military continued until the very end of the Ottoman Empire, which didn't perform well and did not necessarily create a major problem. And the performance of the military continued to push for major changes in the system, such as that of the introduction of the bureaus, limitation of power of the Sultan, protecting the lives of the viziers and the grand viziers and other high officials from arbitrary rule of the government. An arbitrary rule of the government could no longer be sustained without a legal system that provided for it. And we will see what happened to it as we go along. However, the whole idea of change was accepted. The perfect system was no longer. There was a drop from the perfect system, as a result of which there emerged two major forces, one pushing for change and progress, the other pushing for going back to the future, to the glorious past. And these two forces have been battling since 1718, 300 years. They will be with us for a long time to come. Whoever is going to teach this course in the next generation will probably be telling the same thing. They're not going to go away, and in fact, now it seems as if the latter have the upper hand in Turkish politics. And these places change over time, from time to time. So, at the end of this, I'll depart with telling you that this is a process which you may consider as one of modernization and secularization of the system and resistance to it. A clash between one camp that is fully embedded in the idea of reason, science as the engine of progress, another fully embedded in tradition. Keeping the tradition, not severing it. Upholding the tradition and all that comes with it, religion and otherwise. And upholding that. And the clash between these two, which is a cultural clash, therefore I call it Kulturkampf in Turkey, has been around for a long time. And it looks as if from time to time one side has the upper hand and seems to be almost winning this war, but then we discover the other side coming up with a strong challenge again. And this has been going on for the last 300 years. I'll stop here, let you absorb all of this, and then go on next week with what it brought about, how it changed the system, and how it triggered the war of liberation under the influence of nationalism as well, which is another part of the big legacy we received from the past. Not only the Ottoman legacy, but also the war of liberation is an integral part of the history which produced the political culture of this country as we consume it today. Have a nice week.